Elder and Senator Teresa Donovan for your blessing to start us off with grace and understanding. And it's wonderful to be joined by the leadership of both Willow Lake and Fort McKay Métis Nations, and I'm pleased to be joined by Ministers for Indigenous Relations, Rick Wilson, Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, and Minister of Municipal Affairs, Rick McIver, to support you in today's important announcement, which is a step forward, I believe, in reconciliation and partnership in supporting the economic aspirations of Métis people in Alberta. This is Métis Week, and I'm very proud to acknowledge it with an announcement of government backing for Willow Lake Métis Nation and Fort McKay Métis Nation as they raise their voices to defend their right to a prosperous future. Speaking truth to power is a necessity for free, open, and democratic nations. But still we find that too many voices are being discounted. That's one of the reasons I'm proud to announce that both of these nations will be the next recipients of funding from the Indigenous Litigation Fund grant. We set up this program with $10 million in funding to support Indigenous groups and coalitions to have an equal say before the courts in the fight for market access and environmentally responsible resource development. We took this approach because the vast majority of Indigenous groups of nations are pro-responsible development, but too often those voices have been forgotten, ignored, and sidelined in the debate about resource development in Canada. This grant will provide more than $372,000 to the Willow Lake Métis Nation and Fort McKay Métis Nation to help them in their legal fight against the federal Oiler Tanker Moratorium Act, also known as Bill C-48. With that act, in the last Parliament, the federal government denied these two communities access to markets that would create tremendous prosperity for their people and for their neighbors, for all Albertans. It takes away a major opportunity that would ensure economic security and would enable them to help preserve the Métis way of life. Banning the transport of bitumen from Canada's northwest coast is very simply a prejudicial attack on Alberta and its vital economic interests. It is the first time in Canadian history that the federal government has banned the export of one particular product, in this case, a product that is only produced in Alberta and almost completely produced in our northeast, in the Wood Buffalo region, in the region of these two Métis nations. Right now, this bill imposes a huge obstacle for Indigenous communities who already face a host of challenges to their long-term economic security. Through the Indigenous Litigation Fund, Alberta's government is already proudly supporting the Woodland Cree First Nations' crucial legal challenge to the federal No More Pipelines law, Bill C-69, which was another full-frontal attack on the industry that is the engine of jobs and social progress for so many Indigenous people in Alberta and across Canada. Any legal action that helps Alberta develop its natural resources responsibly and gets them to tidewater is eligible for support through this litigation fund. It includes our forestry products, for example. And we'll fund Indigenous recipients outside of our province so long as they're advancing interests that also benefit Alberta First Nations. It's unfortunate that we must resort to judicial references and lawsuits. Canada's new Environment Minister recently said in Scotland that he supports, quotes, the rights of Indigenous people and the inclusion of their traditional knowledge in the fight against climate change. Well, we all need to fight against climate change, but we also need to respect the economic rights of Indigenous communities, the right to move their people from poverty to prosperity through responsible development of the land and the resources that lie below the land that their ancestors have inhabited for centuries and millennia. We must protect the economic rights of Indigenous people, including the right to responsible resource development. And resource development has been one of the greatest benefits in the modern history of Indigenous people in these lands. Indigenous-run businesses are taking on an increasing share of oil sands spending, reaching $2.5 billion as of 2019. This is an accumulated total of about $6 billion between 2017 and 2019 alone. We don't have more recent statistics. Indigenous people are a growing proportion of the oil and gas workforce, making up 7.5% of that workforce in Alberta back in 2019. For comparison, Indigenous people make up only 3.3% of overall employment in Canada, meaning that Indigenous people are twice as likely to be employed in Canada's largest industry, which happens to be Alberta's oil and gas industry, than in any other occupation. A report by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute shows that Indigenous communities are involved, that are involved in the oil and gas sector, have amongst the highest personal Indigenous incomes in the country, which underscores the critical importance of that sector to their own economies. Now, for example, the average income of an employed Indigenous person in Canada is about $47,000. But if they're employed in natural gas and oil extraction, it's $144,000. If they're employed in building pipelines, it's $143,000. In other words, Indigenous people, including members of these Métis Nations, on average, make incomes that are more than 3 times higher than the average. That's what I mean by moving people from poverty to prosperity. And you all know the stories about so many people who grew up in poverty, sometimes had to rely on programs like welfare, got the training, got these kinds of jobs, saved up and became contractors, and then started small businesses that became mid-sized businesses, and in some cases have grown to become big businesses. That's called taking control of your destiny, not having to be dependent on the government or others. It's about independence. And when we talk about self-government, what is most important is that economic independence that comes with this kind of empowerment. The Canadian Energy Centre explored the 2016 census to compare incomes. The Fort McKay First Nation, which is involved with the energy industry, of course, in a big way, has a higher median income than do Canadians at large. So members of the Fort McKay First Nation are generating on average $61,000 a year in income compared to the national average income of $53,000. Now, I know that doesn't fit the stereotype that many of the Laurentian elites in the media would like to depict of hopeless poverty in First Nations and Indigenous communities. This breaks through the stereotype in a positive, encouraging way, but only because of that responsible resource development. Take away the resources, take away the ability to ship them, as some in Ottawa would seem to want to do, and you take away those incomes, and you push people back into poverty. So this is, I think, a moral question for us. These benefits are likely some of the reasons that a majority of Indigenous people support responsible resource development. A 2021 Environics poll commissioned by the Indigenous Resource Network found that 65% of Indigenous respondents said that they support oil and gas development. 65%. You would never know that if all you did was listen to the CBC, by the way. Why aren't these voices being heard more loudly in the public debate? Why are they being marginalized, ignored, and sometimes ridiculed, when all they're doing is seeking a future for their people? Moreover, a report from the Canadian Energy Centre shows that out of 48 Alberta First Nations, and I apologize, but I don't believe this included the Métis Nations, this is the Treaty Nations. Out of 48 Alberta First Nations, 46 of the 48 were found to be supportive of oil extraction and development, including pipeline construction, and none of the 48 registered opposition. You would never know that if all you did was to follow the debate that happens in media and social media. It's the reverse of what is so often depicted. 2 First Nations were either unclear or information was not available or not applicable. So that's 95% plus. 40 BC First Nations were found to be in favor of natural gas development, with none found to be opposed. And the British Columbia Court of Appeal decision on the Trans Mountain expansion which was ratified, I believe in a 7-2 judgment by the Supreme Court of Canada, found as a legal finding that 120 of the 128 First Nations in British Columbia either support or are neutral about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project, and only 3 of 128 are actively opposed, and yet those 3 seem to have 90% of the media attention, the legal support from foreign-funded special interests going to court, and many politicians in Ottawa. I believe we need to listen to respectfully and patiently to the voices of Indigenous Canadians who have concerns or who have opposition to resource projects. Their voices absolutely must be listened to. And of course, the Crown has a duty to consult on every one of these projects, and consult seriously and in good faith, carefully and in detail. All of those things must be said. But as the BC Appeal Court and the Supreme Court of Canada said, we cannot allow a situation where 3 communities are able to overrule the aspirations and the interests of 120 communities on that particular issue. And on the issue that we're discussing here, which is the federal shipping moratorium off the northwest BC coast of bitumen, the Nisga'a First Nation, which was the first in British Columbia to obtain full self-government, sovereignty over its territory, they want to use that power. They want to use that sovereignty to advance their economic prospects and employment for their young people, which is why they opposed Bill C-48, the federal tanker moratorium. They wanted to be the host nation for a terminus that could responsibly ship Canadian energy to global markets, and yet they were shut down in that right unilaterally by the federal government, I repeat, without consultation. There was no consultation with First Nations and Métis communities, with Indigenous people on the tanker moratorium. No one in Ottawa discharged the Crown's constitutional obligation to consult, rooted in the duty of the Crown. There was no consultation, and so the Nisga'a Nation and these Métis nations and so many others were left without a voice when it came to balancing their economic interests within the environmental imperative. That's why we created the Indigenous Litigation Fund, to give for Indigenous communities who want a voice on their economic rights to be able to enter into the courts with support. So let me close by saying that this fund is part of the broader effort by Alberta to pursue reconciliation through practical measures that lift people up, respecting the historical and essential role of Indigenous people on these lands, the wisdom that they hold, their attachment to the environment, and their rightful economic aspirations, which is why we also created the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, backstopped by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the Alberta Crown, to facilitate not just these old school benefit agreements, which can be helpful, but to take this to a totally different level of Indigenous ownership, co-ownership, and real financial participation in major projects. So I'm very excited. I want to say thank you very much to these nations for stepping forward, for their leadership. I'm sure they'll get some criticism, but you ran for public office, so you're used to that. The important thing is you're taking leadership, and we appreciate that. We appreciate being partners with you, and look forward to working with you on other priorities to pursue the broader path of reconciliation and, as my friend Rick Wilson calls it, reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those words, Premier. Speaking of supporting men, I would like to bring Minister Rick Wilson to the stand, please. Not a trial, not the stand.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for today's announcement. And thank you, Teresa, for the lovely prayer and for being a good friend. The communities have welcomed me so much. I just feel like I'm here with my family. You've been so kind to me, and thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. I want to acknowledge the Métis people in Alberta who have a deep connection with this land. And I also want to highlight that today, this whole week, is Métis Week, as we celebrate the culture and the history and contributions of the many Métis people in Alberta. Thank you, Premier, for that kind words. It was heartening to hear you say that. It means a lot. Estella, President of Willow Lake Métis Nation, Ron Quintal, President of the Fort McKay, Justin, my good friend Justin, Vice President and CEO of Willow Lake. I look like this because every time I've been up there 3 times this summer and these guys feed me like, it's amazing. Lots of bannock and bison. Welcome to you both, and to all of you, and thank you for traveling to be here with us. As the Premier mentioned, we've got Minister Sonia Savage with us and Minister Rick McIver with us as well. Thank you for coming. And Tanny Yao, I saw him. Give us a wave. There's Tanny right there, MLA for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. And Mayor Sandy Bowman as well for attending. Is Sandy here? No, well, she didn't make, sorry. So today we're here to provide grant funding through the Indigenous Litigation Fund. As you challenge a federal act, it's a barrier for getting natural resources to market. Even before Alberta was a province, the Métis people were essential to the trade and the commerce of this land. And that hasn't changed. Today, more than ever, we look to you to help move our economy forward by developing businesses and creating jobs. Ron was just telling me of all the new businesses that he's got on the go, like lead follower, get out of his way. That's he's got a lot of great things going there. We're also aware of the unique barriers you face, and today we're happy to help you by removing at least one of those barriers. As the Premier mentioned, Fort McKay, Willow Lake have successfully applied and got Indigenous Litigation Fund granting to fight against the oil tanker moratorium, also known as the tanker ban. Alberta's government is supportive of Indigenous communities taking legal actions that support responsible resource development in Alberta. Indigenous communities already face more barriers to economic security than other communities in Alberta, and this litigation fund helps those communities fight back. The Indigenous Litigation Fund was a platform commitment, and it's actually the second grant that we've given out now. The first went to the Woodland Cree First Nation for legal action against Bill C-69, also known as the No More Pipeline Bill. Today we're happy to help you stand up against an act that hampers your ability to get natural resources and products overseas to markets. The Oil Tanker Moratorium Act also makes it harder for you and other Métis people to set up long-term economic development projects. Indigenous peoples who favor resource development often don't have the means to voice their concerns through the courts. But now the Indigenous Litigation Fund will make sure that your voice is heard. In the long run, standing up in the courts may mean that you can reap the full benefits of your investment in natural resources. When your businesses succeed, then we all succeed. There are more jobs and a stronger economy to benefit all. So I want to thank you, the Métis leaders that are here today, for taking a stand for Alberta and our natural resource sector. Thank you so much for doing that. We're on the road to regaining a vital Alberta economy. Like, the good news that's coming out is just music to my ears. It's just, what was it last week, Premier? $7 billion. Amazing. And we're committed to real, meaningful reconciliation, like the Premier called it, reconciliation. I know you have a lot of work ahead with this legal action, and Alberta's government is going to stand with you. Together, we can all be partners in prosperity. So thanks again for today.
Thank you very much, Minister. As he said before, Willow Lake and Fort McKay Métis Nation have had wonderful visits with Minister Wilson and his staff, and it's always wonderful to have him attend. It is very much like family. I'd love to welcome to the podium, not the stand, Vice President of Willow Lake Métis Nation, Jason Bourque.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to start off by thanking Senator Teresa Donovan for her opening prayer and blessings for today's events. I'd also like to thank the Premier, Minister Wilson, for your opening comments and support for Indigenous peoples within Alberta. Without your support, the impacts of Bill C-48 on our communities would continue to go unchallenged. The Willow Lake Métis Nation is a community of Métis people with roots in the fur trade era that document back to 1856 and residing on and around the shores of Willow Lake. Our community was a critical stopping point along the trade and travel routes connecting Fort Chipewyan in the north to Lac La Biche in the south and Lac La Loche in the east. Today is the center of the oil sands development in Alberta, and along with it referred to as Sagdi Alley. Our resilience as a people in a region of significant development has required us to continually adapt to the changing environment and progress as a people, or get left behind. Over the years, we have developed our capacity to work in collaboration with industry around us. We hold each other accountable, and through engagement, we help ensure social, environment, economic, and other effects are adequately taken into consideration. It is through these engagements that our nation has had the ability to progress our people, to provide for our citizens, and to protect our communities and culture. While the federal government provides programming such as education, healthcare, and other services for Indigenous peoples across this country, we have had to provide these services ourselves. Our businesses, our business ventures, our economic opportunity have provided a form of equality for our nation. Equality between our nation and other Indigenous peoples, and have provided equality where the federal government has not. Bill C-48 constrains Alberta's ability to access international markets, which in turn negatively impacts our economy, our prosperity, and our ability to provide, protect, and progress our people further. It impairs our ability and Alberta's ability to sustainably develop our natural resource. The federal government did this without engaging or consulting or incorporating our views. This was not honorable or in keeping with reconciliation. Willow Lake Métis Nation would like to thank the Alberta government for recognizing the importance of supporting Indigenous peoples within Alberta and for supporting us in this challenge of BC-48 to ensure that our rights are protected. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Vice President Bourque. It is my pleasure to invite President Ron Quintal of Fort McKay Métis Nation.
Thank you to all in attendance. First and foremost to Kokum, our Senator Teresa Donovan. I want to thank her for her opening prayer. I want to thank Premier Kenney for his attendance. Minister Wilson, a very good friend of the community of our Métis Nation. I'd like to welcome Minister Sonia Savage and Minister Rick McIver, who are in attendance to support this critical endeavor on behalf of not just the Indigenous people of Alberta, but the general public of our province, to be able to move our industry towards prosperity. I want to acknowledge my other senators, Marge Wood and Ernest Tremblay, for making the trip to attend, and my council. As we look at the discussion today, we are looking at something that is absolutely critical to the success of not just my nation, but other Indigenous nations throughout Canada. The legislation of Bill C-48 has stymied people's ability to be able to achieve prosperity. I am pleased on behalf of my nation and on behalf of our sister nation of Willow Lake to be able to move towards taking this fight to the federal government. We in Fort McKay have done things that were said were not achievable for Métis people. And we have been able to prove time and time again that we as a people can find prosperity. And we've done it together. And we've done it with the hand in hand with the oil industry. Our mantra in Fort McKay is a hand up, not a handout. And this is something that we have stood by time and time again. Because of the fact that we chose to earn our way. We chose to work towards prosperity. We have moved our people to just that, to prosperity. And I apologize to my PR staff, I'm going off script. But the Premier made some very good points, and I feel the need to be able to add to that.
I went off script too.
The Fort McKay Métis Nation and Willow Lake are making one message very clear today. That what the federal government has put forward by way of the tanker ban is a barrier. They have shut a door directly in our face that we will use to be able to not just help our communities prosper, but other communities to prosper. The reality is this. In an age of reconciliation, the Prime Minister has spoken quite passionately that he wants to see reconciliation in action. Reconciliation is not just about coming to Indigenous people and offering beads and blankets. Reconciliation is about opportunity. It is about highlighting opportunities for other Indigenous peoples to follow. And with that said, we need to be very, very, very critical on the fact that Indigenous people of this country want opportunities. This tanker ban restricts that. Directly restricts our opportunities to prosper. Economic reconciliation will be the path forward. We do not need Ottawa to send us money to be able to achieve reconciliation. We need Ottawa to form legislation that allows us to be successful, that eliminates barriers, not puts more in place. As Métis and Indigenous people, we have faced barriers from governments throughout generations. This legislation is just another barrier that we now have to overcome. When the Métis people have taken control of their destiny and have moved our people forward, and we have been able to buy our own land, set up a group of companies to be able to deliver services to our people, directly to our people. We do that 100% in-house with zero government funding. We've done it through agreements with industry, and we've done it through our economic development arm in the Fort McKay Métis group of companies, which in this year we are on target for $120 million in gross business. That should be a reflection for other communities to follow. That should be where the attention of the federal government should be, is to be able to uphold and empower Indigenous communities to be successful. One major aspect I want to make very clear: when C-48 was introduced, there was no consultation. There was no discussion. It was just a blanket shutdown of an industry that not only helps this province prosper, but our sister provinces prosper as well. We are pro-sustainable development. We are pro-business. We want to be able to show the rest of this country what success can be, what success can look like. I'm sorry that we don't fall under the paradigm of the Indigenous peoples who are anti-development or anti-oil. That's just not how we do business. We do business in a way that builds partnerships, builds relationships. And from that foundation, we are able to move not just this country forward, society in general forward. We are able to change stereotypes. We are able to change views. We are able to change opinions. If the Indigenous people of this country are to be given a voice, it needs to be one of opportunity and discussion. The tanker ban took away that opportunity. That took away that discussion. And for us to move forward as Indigenous people, we need to take this very seriously. Because my community is not just doing this, Willow Lake's community is not just doing this for the sake of doing it. We're doing it for Albertans. We're doing it for Indigenous people. This is why we're undertaking this fight, is so that we can be able to create a conversation. Pro-sustainable development And you know what? We're pro-regulation. No other industry in this country is as regulated as the oil industry in Alberta. We need to allow regulation to do its job. Allow Indigenous peoples to have a conversation about a project in their traditional territory. Not just completely shut the door in their face and not allow their voices to be heard. How is that reconciliation? We need to take this very seriously. Not just from a legal precedent, but from a political one as well. Going forward, if we are to find success, the federal government will need to look very seriously at, instead of restricting prosperity, they need to look at becoming involved in it. Because I can assure you of one thing, my community will not stop. We will continue to succeed. We will continue to provide tangible benefits to our people. Benefits that were unfounded before. One thing that we hold very near and dear to our hearts in Fort McKay is that we are a community that has achieved many firsts. And we're hoping that this legislation will be another. It will be the first opportunity for Indigenous communities to be able to take a stand and say, no, we need to talk about this. This needs to change. And going forward from this, to all of my colleagues on council, we need to be ready. To my sister community of Willow Lake, we need to be ready. With today's announcement, there's going to be criticism. I welcome it. At least it's a conversation. If you can criticize my opinion, let's talk about that. Because we weren't even offered that much when they introduced Bill C-48. Going forward, I want to make one thing very clear. We take the relationship and the partnership with the Alberta government very seriously. Mr. Premier, we thank you for your support. Minister Wilson, we thank you for your support. And we look forward to creating further conversation on this. Prime Minister Trudeau, I know you're in Edmonton today. We welcome you to the traditional territory of the Métis people. Let's have a conversation. But at the end of the day, come hell or high water, the Fort McKay Métis Nation and the Willow Lake Métis Nation look to change the entire conversation throughout this country. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We are now going to move to the official signing ceremony. The signing ceremony will take place to my left, your right. So I invite President Stella Lavallee, President Ron Quintal, and Minister Rick Wilson to the table, please.
All right, thanks, folks. We're now going to move over to a quick media Q&A. Just a reminder to journalists in the room, we do have a microphone set up at the back for questions. And if I could get our delegates, President Lavallee and President Quintal, to join Minister Wilson and Premier Kenney at that podium for the Q&A. Before we jump to the phones to see if anyone's online, we're just going to start in the room here with Graham Thompson.
A question for the Premier, but also the leaders may want to answer this one too. A little while ago, before this news conference began, there was a news release put up by the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I'm quoting here from the headline, Premier. It says, Métis Nation of Alberta condemns Premier Kenney's financial support of illegitimate organizations. Just to continue quoting from the news release, today Premier Kenney is standing with a handful of unaccountable, undemocratic, and illegitimate organizations. And he says, to go on, I'm quoting here, this is a bad decision by the Premier and represents a clear misuse of public money. What do you make of this? This is an organization that represents, it says, 51,000 people. It's clearly not happy with you and what you've done today, Premier. What do you say to that?
Well, these are our two Métis nations whose leadership is elected by their local members of the community. These are community groups. We work constructively with Indigenous groups across the province. And I don't think it's reasonable for one person to say that every single Métis community needs to go to her to have permission to have a perspective. But with that, I perhaps invite President Quintal, Vice President Bourque, or Minister Wilson, who are more familiar with the jurisdictional issues there.
So in relation to the question, when we look at Fort McKay and Willow Lake, we are we've declared our own constitutions. We have our own governance structures. We have our own defined membership lists. We don't hold any membership within the Métis Nation of Alberta. We basically are communities who are trying to bring prosperity on behalf of our communities. The difference between ourselves and the Métis Nation of Alberta is that we are rights-bearing Métis people. Our rights have been recognized, Fort McKay's rights have been recognized through the credible assertion process, meaning that we are a Pauli community, recognized Pauli community with harvesting rights as well as consultation rights. The first community in Alberta history to be able to achieve that. Our sister community is very close behind in achieving that as well. I don't really want to comment in relation to the Métis Nation of Alberta because, it's a lot of nonsense. We're already in the middle of a number of litigation cases with the Métis Nation of Alberta, and I don't think it's appropriate for them to be able to condemn anything when they better look in the mirror if they're going to be condemning any type of malfeasance or inappropriate behavior.
I'd also like to add to that. I guess the beautiful thing is living in this country is that you have a right to believe and say what you like, and press can also write the same. So the one thing that you did note that I would like to highlight is that I believe it was said 55,000 citizens or members, I believe, within the Métis Nation. True fact that within Alberta we're at about on an estimate about 110,000 Métis people within Alberta. So the organization represents half of that population. So I question who represents the other half. I can guarantee you within the Willow Lake Métis Nation, everybody within our community is a member of the Willow Lake Métis Nation and not a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So I think when it comes down to a number of court cases and such, we really need to understand who represents who. And I can assure you that the Willow Métis Nation, our governance structure, our citizens, all know who represent them.
Thanks very much. Graham, did you have a follow-up today?
Follow-up to the Premier, our Minister Wilson. Did you approach the Métis Nation of Alberta, Minister Wilson? Because I know that, as the Speaker pointed out, there's been a sort of perennial issue between various groups in the Métis community over who actually represents whom. So have you talked to the Métis Nation of Alberta about this? And if you haven't, will you talk to them now about their complaints?
Well, no, this was an initiative brought forward by these two nations, and we support all the Métis people of Alberta. A good number of my family are members of the MNA, and we've got the MNA, we've got the Métis settlements, now we've got the Métis groups here. there's not just one group that represents all of the Métis people. So that's about all I can say on that. There's several Métis groups out there.
And we're always happy to work with the MNA as we have on a number of issues. Just to give you one example, with their leadership, we set up a number of special COVID-19 vaccination clinics for Métis people in the province in cooperation with MNA, and I know Minister Wilson has ongoing work with the Métis Nation of Alberta. I would just point out one thing that in Madame Poitras' news release, which is factually inaccurate. She asserts that these nations here are challenging a federal law which she says increased or Indigenous consultation on resource projects. In fact, she may be confusing this with Bill C-69. We would contest that assertion on Bill C-69. But there's absolutely nothing in C-48 about Indigenous consultation, which is partly the whole point of this legal challenge. There was zero consultation of First Nations, Treaty Nations, non-Treaty Nations in BC, Métis organizations here. There was no consultation, and there is no framework for consultation in Bill C-48, the tanker moratorium. So that's violating the constitutional principle of the Crown's duty to consult, grounded in the honor of the Crown, and that's why we think there is a credible legal claim to be made in this instance.
Thank you, Premier. Just before we wrap things up, I just want to check on the operator to see if someone has joined the queue. I think that is a no. So we are concluding today's event. Thanks so much, everyone.